to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello and welcome to Two Roads Crossing. My name is Dr. Barry Schwenk. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host as we explore the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. I just thought of this the other day. I was at a meeting in Phoenix, and we were supposed to go around the room and introduce ourselves and tell like what we do. And I said, "Hi, my name is Dr. Barry Schwenk. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and and I had to catch myself because I guess I've done enough of these now that it's just part of who I am, I guess. I don't know. But if this is your first time joining us, welcome. If it's not your first time, welcome back. It's always a joy to have some time to set aside to talk about that intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. And today we're going to be focusing on well-being. CVM has a new initiative to help veterinary professionals with well-being. And as part of that, I get the privilege of talking with Dr. Rob Goodman. And today, we've been talking about the different domains within well-being. And I think in our last conversation, we talked about physical well-being. But today I want to talk about something a little bit more challenging and more difficult is emotional well-being. Because I think as veterinary professionals, every day we face really high highs and really low lows. And not only are we expected to be constantly in the act of balancing our own emotions, but also we're kind of expected to help our medical team through that process, our families through that process, our clients through that process, and it can be overwhelming to say the least. And so we need a little help, and that's why I have called you, Dr. Rob Goodman. Welcome back.
Oh, it is good to be here and hearing your story about going on autopilot as you introduced yourself. That's one of the things that we do in regulating our emotions, our middle pathways. We go on automatic, and it helps us to survive the day. But as you recognize, sometimes we need to be able to switch that off.
That's right. And in many ways, I need to switch a lot of things off, and I'm not always good. I'm not always good about doing that, but I really appreciate you in several ways. One, kind of spearheading this initiative on well-being. It's been very beneficial for me and for those that have been listening. I want to talk though about emotional well-being today, and I don't even really know where to start. So when you're kind of leading a group of folks like us that don't know where to start, where do you begin with emotional well-being?
Well, I started the beginning in Genesis, and the first question that God asks the human ones, asks Adam and Eve, is, Adam, where are you? And Adam responds and says, I was naked and I was ashamed, and so I hid from you. And so Adam, his first response to this question is about his emotional response to his circumstances. And so that question, where are you, is the one that I often introduce to say, even to myself, to say, okay, it's actually my journal prompt. Where are you? What am I feeling right now? To actually be able to recognize what I am feeling, because we get so habituated to not feeling, just to survive the day. We can't experience if we're in a clinic, we can't experience the fullness of our emotions and still see the next client. Yeah. And so we learn to kind of put our emotions in a little box, and we tell ourselves, hey, I'll sort through this later. But just like my junk drawer, later doesn't come until it overflows.
That's
so really being able to, at a regular interval, check in with where I really am is the place that I begin with emotional well-being, is actually feeling those emotions.
Well, and for a lot of us, that's even just asking that question is a really tough one. One, because I think for a lot of us, we feel really rushed and really busy, and all of those boxes oftentimes remain closed because we just don't feel like we have the time and the opportunity or even the place to kind of delve into that. So how do you encourage people to actually ask that question and to follow through?
I think one is having permission to ask that,
Mm,
and particularly permission to experience those emotions in the presence of God. Oftentimes as I say, okay, when I get everything worked out and I'm ready, then I can go and pray.
mm, yeah.
And if we take the time to read through the Psalms, I think David expresses every human emotion at some point in the Psalms. I've yet to find one that he doesn't express.
Mm,
And so I find the Psalms tremendously permission giving to say, okay, I can feel this in the presence of God.
mm,
And actually the discipline of reading the Psalms daily is a discipline that it helps me to encounter emotions when they're safe.
mm.
Not in the midst of I'm feeling grief or I'm feeling anger, but I can encounter those emotions in the presence of God when they're not as strong, and it teaches me to encounter them in the presence of God, so that when they are strong, I can still bring them to God.
Yeah,
And so,
that's a good like practice, leads to perfection. Like the idea of if you wait to think about grief when you're in that grieving moment, it's like changing the car's tire while you're driving. It's a little bit overwhelming.
yeah, I had a mentor that he taught on emergency medicine, and in his emergency medicine slide deck, the second slide was Snoopy doing his little happy dance. It said, "The time to learn to dance is not the night of the problem."
No, that's
And so
exactly
the
exactly right.
time to learn to feel is not in the midst of these overpowering emotions. But we also get so tied up in not feeling that we even forget how to name emotions. And so to actually be able to name, and there are a number of tools on the internet. If you Google emotion wheel, you can find these wheels much like a wine tasting wheel, that goes from very simple to complex.
Mm,
And they can be useful, but oftentimes it's the journey, not the product, that's most useful.
mm,
And so I start out with this very simple emotion question of, am I feeling happy or sad?
mm,
And then go from, or positive or negative, good or bad, however that simple is. And then I say, in what way? And if I dive into the sad, I'm like, well, maybe I'm kind of a little angry.
mm,
And then I say, in what way? And I dive in a little bit more, and it's like, maybe I feel abandoned,
mm.
or let down by someone. And so in that way, I can dig and simply start asking questions as an emotion comes up, and say, in what way? How would I describe that deeper? And I do that in pastoral care as well. As we start to encounter emotions, that in what way question is a wonderful question. I think we're going to talk later on relational, but it's also a great question in relationships to simply say, in what way? Because it opens up for an elaboration of experience.
No, and that's exactly, I think, getting to the root, and having that kind of emotional intelligence, not just knowing what you're feeling, but how you're feeling and why you're feeling. Uh, because again, when you mentioned that overflowing junk drawer, what oftentimes happens is you have this cacophony of emotions that you've just been shoving in there, and then you have something that just breaks the bank, and then all of these things come spilling out, and you're not really even sure why you're feeling those things, and it's because you had put it in the back of the drawer and it's made its way forward. And so being able to decipher where those emotions have come from, why you're feeling them, even getting to the root of the behaviors or the circumstances that have triggered those emotions can be really helpful. Certainly helpful within relationships, whether it's at work. Oh my goodness. understanding what your clients may be going through, understanding their emotional responses and the wide, varied emotional responses they might have is helpful. Same thing for your medical team as well. So you have to allow yourself this time prior to feeling the emotion to explore and to understand how that may come spilling out. What do you find is helpful in those moments then? So if you've kind of done some prep work in those moments, how do you then manage the emotions that you have come to realize are part of who you are?
I think one of the things to recognize is that as humans, we have a bias to recognize the things that threaten us
Hmm.
first. And so we encounter those negative emotions, the emotions that focus our attention on an external threat, fear, anger, distress. We experience those very rapidly. And particularly when we're in a high stress situation, that's all we recognize.
Right.
And sometimes we just want to not recognize those. But when we slow down, that's when we can actually encounter the peaceful emotions,
Mm.
happiness, joy, community. And so really kind of recognizing our predisposition to threat,
Mhm.
the practices of gratitude,
Mm.
of stopping and saying, first, this is what I'm grateful for. Um, because that keys our mind to say, okay, there are some good things out there. There
Mm.
are some grateful things.
Mm.
And then, so looking at gratitude, looking at there's a practice of recollection that is recognizing where God is during the day.
Mm.
And that can, again, the Psalms teach us to bring our emotions into the presence of God. The practice of recollection as we go back and into this experience of the day and even just say, okay, Jesus, this was hard. I know you're present with me. Can you show me where you were in that time?
Mm.
We stand on the promise that Jesus says, and I will be with you always, even till the very end of the age. So
Mm.
Jesus is present. Sometimes those fearful emotions narrow our attention such that we don't see things.
Mm.
And so again, that prayerfully opening up and saying, okay, where was Jesus in this? And how do I encounter this experience that caused a strong emotion in the presence of Jesus?
Mm. Yeah, and that's and that can be, I think, that initial work that you put in. I think once you get to that place where you and God are kind of comfortable with the language of struggle and the emotion of struggle.
Yeah.
Like you have to get comfortable with that prior to, so that when you're in the midst of it, then it becomes a little bit easier, I think, to trust, and even even to recognize that um, just this just happened to me last week at the clinic, right? I had a long time client was in our euthanasia room with a patient that we'd seen for a really long time, very familiar with the staff, and then in the room just two doors down, I had a boxer puppy, and I'm going back and forth between these two things, and realizing um, that Jesus is with me in both, and that it was okay for me to touch each of those emotions in each of those different circumstances, going back and forth, but also knowing full well that there will be a time afterwards where the fullness of that emotion is going to come out. The grief from one room and the joy from the other. I was going to be able to, maybe not in that exact moment, because again, in that moment, I've got, the medical team is looking for help in those things, and the clients are looking for help in those things, and so you kind of try to be try to be like Christ for them, but then also once you step out of that room, it's like Christ is kind of pushing you forward, and then when you come out of that room, he's just wrapping his arms around you. And it's a back and forth. So yeah, absolutely. So as you come to grips with those moments, and you start to identify those, I would imagine that part of that process is also recognizing the way that you manage those emotions. So how do you approach that? How do you how do you get to a place of recognizing maybe the things that you're not doing that are leading towards emotional well-being, and then other things that are more positive for you?
I think there are two practices. One kind of the top level preparation, and the other the in the moment. And
Mm,
so that top level preparation for me is the prayer of examen,
mm,
where in the presence of God I review the day, and that's a teaching of recognizing where I am, where God is in the events of the day. And there are a number of ways to do that. The classic one is to simply be in the presence of God, to ask the Holy Spirit to review hour by hour the events of the day,
mm,
calling into my awareness the times that I was aware of God's presence and the times that I was unaware, either willfully or unwillfully unaware of the presence of God, what I
mm.
was trying to hide from God and
Right.
what I was just oblivious to.
Yeah.
And then looking hopefully to the next day. Um, the simpler way to do that, and the way that we did it with my daughter as she was younger, was to end the day with, what are you most grateful for and what are you least grateful for
Mm,
in the day. And then oftentimes in that, what are you least grateful for, you can ask the question, and where was the gift in that?
mm,
Where is God's redeeming love shining through even in this hard time?
mm.
And that was really good until she started to ask those questions back. And when your 9-year old looks at you after you've shared this really
Mm,
hard thing, and she goes, "Daddy, where was the gift?"
mm,
Um,
mhm,
but it was one. I mean, that practice is a simple practice. It can be a relational practice, and it's a great discussion. Um, in in looking at family wise, if you ask your teenager, "How was your day?" Fine.
mm.
Very different question. What was the most exciting thing that happened today? What was your most grateful experience today? What was the best thing? Those kinds of questions elaborate a response that is different from fine. Um, and so that top level practice of examining in the presence of God the events of the day, recognizing God's presence in those, and the redeeming love that God has for all of us in the midst of those days, teaches us again to recognize the presence of God in the harder times. The other kind of more immediate thing, and you mentioned going from one room to another,
Mhm.
and there's a part of that our mind wants to be, okay, what am I going to say to this next client? Did I say the right thing to that next client? How do I manage the grief? Oh, there's a boxer puppy licking my face. To be fully present to where we are. Again,
Mm,
back to that question, where are you? I'm in the exam room with a euthanasia. I'm in an exam room with a puppy.
mm,
The practice of simply being present
mm,
to where I am, and either doorknobs,
mm.
and so touching that door and taking a breath, and just like crossing the street, stop, look, listen, go.
Yep.
To stop for a moment and say, okay, I'm going into this exam room, to look inward and say, wow, how am I feeling? To
Mm,
listen for the voice of God, and then to go in and be present to
mm.
that person. To doorknob, if you wash your hands going into
Mhm,
an exam room, or foam your hands, that's
mhm,
another way of just that tangible feel of, just engaging the sense of touch,
mm.
engages other things in us, and so allows us to be present to those feelings, and to kind of do that little switch between grief and joy in the midst of a busy day.
Yeah. Well, and that's spot on, because going all the way back to when we started, that habitual aspect of it. If you get in the habit of trying to run into the door and just try to do all things for all people at all times. It can get really exhausting. At the same time, every door opening is an opportunity, and that's kind of, that's one of the ways that I've kind of had to approach it, with that that doorknob moment where you have to pause, you have to take a breath, uh you have to invite God to show you what it is that he desires for you to do on the other side of that door. And that means, I think a lot of times it means addressing the emotion, even the emotion in the room, whether it's joy or whether it's grief. I always go back to that, to the story of Lazarus, right? The shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept,
Yeah.
and yet
Yeah.
he wept, yet he knew what he was about to do. And the reason that he wept is that there was this emotional connection that he had with the people that he was serving. And it allows him, even in the face, knowing what great joy was on the other was going to come, he still allowed himself to grieve with them in that moment, knowing full well that he would then be rejoicing with them as well. And being able to move between those well. I love what you said about, um, even just asking that question, because asking those questions allows us to verbalize those things. And that not like one of the more important parts of our emotional, our emotional well-being, is being able to verbalize those things to ourselves and to the people around us.
Yeah, a little neuroscience geeky moment.
Hmm.
If we think about the way our brain works, we take in all of the sensory information of our circumstances.
Hmm.
We filter some of that out before we're even aware of it, and then it first hits our hippocampus and our limbic system, the emotional regulation, and we actually respond before we are cognitively aware in our prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
And so the speed of our response is emotional first,
Hmm.
and logical or conscious thought second. And so a lot of times we will, if we don't verbalize that emotion, it's pulling the switches on us without our ever being aware of it. And once we are able to verbalize it and pull it into that cognitive or the conscious awareness side of things, then we're able to say, wow, is that useful or is that not useful?
Hmm.
Is this being helpful to me? Or actually, it's probably better to say, in what way is this helpful?
Hmm.
And in what way is this harmful?
Hmm.
Because oftentimes our emotions are there for a reason, and there is a helpfulness to our emotions, but there's also a time where our emotions overwhelm the things that we need to do, and they become harmful, or they become self-perpetuating and no longer useful for the situation that we're in.
Well, and that goes to that question, what was it that you were least grateful for today? But then asking the question, where is the gift in that?
Yeah.
Um, we were in Luke chapter 6 this week at church, and it was funny because, like, the way that uh Luke juxtaposes a couple of things where Jesus is being followed, and everyone that touches him is being healed. Demons are being cast out. They find wholeness in Christ, and then immediately Jesus turns to his disciples and said, "But blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are going hungry. Blessed are you who have been reviled and insulted and cast out for my name." And because I think that emotionally, as Christians, we expect that there's healing all of the time, right? And when we're not riding that cloud of joy, and when we're not finding the wholeness that we want, we forget about the promise that even though we face trouble, that Christ is with us, and we have victory. We have victory even in the midst of those struggles. And so there is even in those less grateful moments, there is a gift. And the question is, can we see that gift, and are we willing to accept that gift even in our struggles, and in our pain? And I think that's a really important thing for sure. Hmm.
And yeah, it reminds me, I've as part of my work with CVM, I serve as a volunteer chaplain and provide some pastoral care as people walk through some difficult times. And um, I remember getting a phone call a couple years ago, and this person I'd walked with for quite a while said, "I don't like you very much."
Wait,
And I'm like,
hold on.
"All right."
Your audio cut out for a second. What did you say?
She said, "I don't like you very much."
Oh, that's what I
And
thought you
that
said.
was there wasn't a hello or anything. It's, "I don't like you very much." And I said, "Okay, what's going on?" She said, "Well, remember last year when you said that in this time that I don't like,
Mm.
God's going to be working, and there's something important that's going to come out of this, and I should be aware of it." Well, I recognized that, but then I heard your words coming out of my mouth to my mother.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't like to be reminded that there is a gift in this, that God is always drawing us towards his love, that
Mm.
and I love the promise in Joel that he will redeem the year that the locust ate.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
and that and when you're sitting there looking at the devastation of your hopes, it's really
Mm.
hard. It's hard for us to say, wow, in all of this, I'm going to hope in God because he is faithful and true.
Yeah.
And so that's again part of that community that's able to say, yes, this is bad. This is not good. This is where Jesus wept.
Yeah.
And there is joy.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's part of the beauty of the practice of lament.
Mm.
You mentioned Jesus weeping before he raises Lazarus on the cross. He laments.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think he knew what was coming, and
Mm.
even if he didn't know exactly, he trusted in the love of the Father.
Mm.
But still, on the cross, he allowed himself to feel the utter despair of, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Psalm 22,
Yeah.
and that classic lament of, man, the circumstances are awful, and I am powerless to change them.
Mm.
And God, you are good, so you must change them.
Mm.
And in that, I mean, if we're truly honest in our lament, we go a little bit farther than we're comfortable with God.
Yeah.
God, if you're really good, you need to act, and you need to act now. And my inner toddler comes out as I think about this.
Yeah.
I go, and I'm going to hold my breath until you do.
That's right.
And but there is that pause after that, this silence that's in the Psalms of Lament if we look for it.
Mm.
And then God doesn't necessarily change our circumstances,
Mm.
but he changes our viewpoint.
Yeah.
And all but one of the Psalms of Lament end in praise.
Yeah.
And you alone are God, and I will praise you. And I love the tradition. Psalm 88 is the one that doesn't have praise.
Mm.
And the tradition in that is that that's when God sits with us in our sorrow.
Mm.
That in the Jewish tradition, that's where God sits Shiva with us, where God mourns with us, and we are present to God in our grief, and God is present to us in our grief.
No, that's a powerful place for sure. Well, before we start this conversation, I had three questions in my mind that I wanted to ask you. One is I wanted to know like how we begin with emotional well-being, like how do we become aware of our need and so on. And then I wanted to talk to you about how do you deal with all these negative things, and then what are some of the positive things that you put into practice. And yet I think that we just touched the tip of the iceberg with this one. And so I feel pretty comfortable with the awareness part, but I think I want to talk to you a little bit more about some of the practical aspects of what we do, of how we deal with the negatives, a little bit more in depth, and then what are the positive things that we can put into place to encourage emotional well-being. So, do you mind sticking around and we can talk a little bit more about this?
That would be perfect.
All right. Well, hopefully, as you have been listening, as Dr. Rob and I have been exploring this idea that God has given us emotion for a reason, and yet the emotions that He's given to us can also be quite destructive in our lives and can create a lot of lack of well-being. And yet, as we become more and more aware of his presence in our circumstances, his presence in our lives, his presence even in our emotions, as we learn to be aware of all of those things, hopefully we're learning how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you were blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.